The cough began on a Tuesday morning, the kind that rattles low in your chest and makes you think of old radiators knocking in a drafty house. It came without warning. A sudden spasm that bent me forward over the kitchen counter, one hand braced against the cool laminate while the other gripped my ribcage. The sound startled even me, rough and uneven, tearing through the quiet of the morning, outside my kitchen window. The neighbor's golden retriever pawed at something in the patch of earth under the fence, his tail wagging as if he had discovered treasure. I stood there watching him, my breath still shallow from the fit, feeling that familiar ache spread through my bones. It was not just the ache of sickness, though I could tell something had settled into me. It was the heavier ache of recognition, the kind that whispered I would go through this alone. At 62, solitude had become my default state. I wore it the way some women wear comfortable shoes, sturdy and familiar, though not always flattering. For years I had told myself that independence was strength, that doing everything for myself meant I was capable, self-reliant. I had clung to that idea after my husband Anil died 3 years ago. People tell you grief is sharp, but what they do not prepare you for is how it becomes dull and constant, like carrying a heavy bag you cannot put down. I had learned to shift that weight from one shoulder to another, to live with the strain, but illness has a way of stripping away those little self-deceptions. The cough was followed by a slow burn of fever that pressed into my temples, and with it came a vulnerability I had not felt since the day Anil's heart gave out in our living room. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone. Bella answered. On the fourth ring, my only child, my only family within 100 miles. I think I'm getting sick, I said. My voice was thin, cracking at the edges. Could you stay with me for a few days? There was a pause long enough for me to hear the muffled chaos of her television in the background, the high-pitched shrieking of a reality show argument, canned laughter, and the low hum of her air conditioner. Mom, I'm really swamped at work right now, she said. I could almost see her eyes scanning a mental list of deadlines, errands, or perhaps social plans she had already prioritized over me. Maybe take some Takeout and rest. You'll be fine. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling the fever pulse behind my eyes. Her voice had that tone she used when she wanted to make something disappear without actually dealing with it. The truth is, I had not expected her to say yes. Not really. This was not the first time I had reached out for her help and been met with a polite wall. But even when you expect the disappointment, it still lands like a stone in the chest. After we hung up, I moved slowly through my little two-bedroom house. The walls seemed taller somehow, the rooms wider and emptier than they had been that morning. I set water to boil for tea, not because I wanted it but because it gave me something to do with my hands. I told myself she might call back, that maybe, after her show ended or her mood shifted, she would think of me again. I imagined her walking into my kitchen, setting down a bag of groceries, telling me to sit while she made me soup. But the evening came with no call. The fever grew heavier, my skin hot under the blanket, and every sound in the house seemed amplified. The tick of the wall clock, the occasional pop of the wooden floor settling. I tried to sleep but drifted only in shallow bursts, waking with the same dull ache in my bones. The next morning, I shuffled to the front door when I heard the sound of something being set down on the porch. By the time I opened it, no one was there. A white paper bag sat at my feet, grease spots blooming on the bottom. Takeout. On top was a sticky note with Bella's handwriting, busy today. Feel better soon. I stood there barefoot on the porch, the October air cool on my fevered skin, staring at the neat curve of her letters. No knock on the door, no voice calling my name from the driveway, just a bag of food. Like a delivery driver's drop-off, I brought it inside and set it on the counter. The scent of basil and peanuts drifted up, and my stomach churned. I was not hungry, not for food, not for the kind of concern that could be packaged in plastic containers and left without a word. I leaned against the counter, feeling something inside me shift. Not the sharp shatter of heartbreak I had already survived that years ago. This was different. A deep settling, as if the foundation of who I thought I was had finally adjusted to the reality of what I had become, to the people I loved. 3 days passed in a blur. I drank tea, measured my own temperature, listened to my own labored breathing in the silence. There were no visitors, no follow-up texts beyond that sticky note message in those long hours. I began to take an inventory, not of my possessions but of my life. When had I become so easy to set aside? When had I become a background character in my own story? The answers came in fragments. The years after Annel's death, when Bella's patience for my grief seemed to thin. The months I stopped mentioning my own health issues because she always seemed to have a bigger crisis. The decades of saying yes to every request, being the constant, reliable presence while everyone else pursued lives that barely intersected with mine. By Friday, the fever had broken, but I was left with a clarity that was almost frightening. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, and realized I could not keep living as the afterthought in someone else's life, not my daughter's, not anyone's. I thought of the small farmhouse on the 40 acres that had belonged to Annel's mother. It had been empty for years. Bella had always called it that old place, too far from the city to be practical, but I remembered it differently. The way the light poured through the kitchen windows in the late afternoon, the smell of oak trees after a storm. That morning, a decision rooted itself in me. I was going to disappear from this life, not in anger, but in quiet certainty. I would not wait for Bella to notice me. I would not stand in the same kitchen, year after year, hoping for a different version of the same conversation. I looked again at the untouched bag of takeout on the counter. The food was cold now, the sauce congealed in the containers. I placed it in the trash, tied the bag closed, and carried it outside. The autumn wind lifted my hair from my face, and I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The first breath of a life I had not yet begun but already knew I wanted. The second night of fever came like a tide, slow at first, then relentless, pulling me under waves of heat and chills. I lay in bed, the sheet tangled around my legs, my skin damp with sweat. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making a low, hollow sound that reminded me of winter storms from my childhood. I could not tell if the ache in my chest was from the illness or from the silence pressing in on me. In the darkness, my mind traveled places I had not visited in years. I thought of Annel, of the way he used to bring me tea when I was sick. He would set the cup on the nightstand, then sit beside me, brushing my hair back from my forehead to check for fever. He had a quiet way of making me feel cared for without making me feel weak. That kind of presence is rare. Once you have known it, its absence becomes a constant echo. I turned onto my side and stared at the outline of the dresser in the dim light. A framed photo sat there. The three of us in the park, Bella only 8 years old, her arms wrapped around Annel's neck while I held the picnic basket. She had been a child who laughed easily then. She would run to me when she scraped her knee, curl up beside me during thunderstorms, press sticky hands into mine without hesitation. Somewhere between then and now, that closeness had thinned like a worn fabric. It was not one single moment that changed her. It was years of small ones. The day she came home from high school with makeup on and brushed off my compliment. The first time she skipped Sunday dinner to go out with friends. The way she rolled her eyes when I reminded her to call her grandmother. Independence is necessary for a child, I know that. But there is a difference between building a life of your own and closing the door to the people who made that life possible. The fever deepened and my thoughts wandered further. I remembered the year after Annel died. Bella's visits grew shorter, her phone calls briefer. I told myself she was grieving too, that she needed space to heal in her own way. But when she did come by, her patience seemed thin, like she had a clock ticking in her head. I learned not to bring up my loneliness because it made her uncomfortable. I learned to keep my sadness folded away like linens no one wanted to see. The house creaked in the wind. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come, but instead I drifted in a half-dream where I was walking through my kitchen and finding it empty, the cupboards bare, the walls stripped of color. It felt like a picture of my life, functional, still, standing, but missing something essential. When morning came, I sat up slowly, every muscle stiff. The fever had not broken yet, but my mind was sharper than the night before. I boiled water for tea and stood by the kitchen window again, watching the neighbor's dog chase a squirrel across the yard. The sight should have been amusing, but it only reminded me of how long it had been since I laughed without forcing it. By midday, the phone had not rung. No text from Bella. The absence of contact was not surprising, but it was still a weight I could feel in my shoulders. I thought again of the sticky note she had left with the takeout. Busy today. Feel better soon. The words were polite enough, but they carried the cold efficiency of someone checking a task off a list. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and let my mind wander to the idea of being cared for. What did it even mean anymore? Was it someone sitting beside you while you were sick? Was it someone listening without looking at their phone? Or was it simply someone choosing to be present without being asked? The truth settled in me like a stone at the bottom of a pond. Care, for me, had become something I gave out endlessly but received only in fragments. I thought of the countless times I had shown up for Bella, watching her children when she needed a night out, lending her money when her car broke down, listening to her frustrations about work late into the night. None of those things were wrong, that is what family is supposed to do, but somewhere along the way, the giving had stopped being mutual. The fever pulled at me again, and I went back to bed this time. I let my thoughts drift toward the farmhouse. I could see it clearly in my mind. The peeling paint on the porch railing, the old rocking chair that had belonged to Annel's mother, the oak trees lining the drive. I had not been there in years. But I remembered the smell of the earth after rain, the way the air felt cleaner, quieter. The more I pictured it, the more it began to feel less like a memory and more like a possibility. That night, I dreamed of packing a single suitcase and walking out the front door without telling anyone. In the dream, the air outside was cool, the sky pale blue, and the road ahead curved gently out of sight. I felt no fear, only the lightness of someone finally stepping out from under a shadow. When I woke, the dream clung to me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, hearing my own breath in the stillness. The thought of leaving did not feel impossible. It felt necessary. I made soup for myself, moving slowly around the kitchen. The act of cooking, even when I had little appetite, brought a kind of calm. I sliced carrots, celery, and onion, listening to the steady rhythm of the knife on the cutting board. As the broth simmered, I sat at the table and wrote a list in my notebook. Not a to-do list, but a list of what I wanted my life to feel like: peace, purpose, space to breathe. I wrote those words without hesitation. They looked strange in my handwriting, as if they belonged to someone else, someone bolder. But I kept writing. I wanted mornings without the constant hum of traffic outside my window. I wanted nights where the darkness was full of crickets instead of sirens. I wanted to learn something new, to prove to myself that my life was not finished, simply because I had passed 60. By the time the soup was ready, the list was longer. The fever still burned in my body, but my mind felt lighter. I knew that I could not change Bella. I could not make her see me as she once did. But I could change the way I lived. I ate a small bowl of soup, then washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands. The act felt grounding, as if I were clearing not just the sink but a space in my own mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something important. I was not afraid of being alone. I had been alone in many ways for years. What I was afraid of was staying in a life where my presence made so little difference that it could be replaced by a bag of takeout and a text message. The wind outside shifted, and the house seemed to sigh with it. I closed my eyes and let the thought of the farmhouse fill me again. The quiet, the space, the freedom to start over. I did not know when or how I would go, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would. The morning came with a pale sun pressing against the curtains. My fever had eased but left behind a heaviness in my limbs, like my body was still unsure whether it could trust the day. I lay in bed for a while, listening to the muted hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional passing car, the faint tick of the wall clock. The silence between those sounds was thick enough to feel. When I finally rose, the air in the house felt cold against my skin. I shuffled toward the kitchen, holding the railing along the way. The front door caught my eye. A brown paper bag sat on the doormat. No knock, no message, no shadow moving away. Just the bag, folded neatly at the top, with a bright yellow sticky note stuck to it. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp air. The bag was heavier than I expected, warm against my hand. I glanced at the note. Bella's handwriting was quick and neat. The kind you use when you are in a rush. Busy today. Feel better soon. I read it twice. The words were friendly in the way that office emails are friendly, courteous, efficient, and carrying the unspoken message that the sender has already moved on to their next task. Inside the bag I found 2 containers from the Thai place we used to order from on Friday nights, when Bella still lived at home. Back then, we would set the food on the coffee table and watch whatever movie she picked, even if it was something I had no interest in. I used to love watching her eat. The way she'd mix the noodles with the curry until every bite was coated The way she talked through mouthfuls about her week, seeing the same food now, delivered without a face or a word, made it feel like a ghost of those nights. I placed the containers on the counter and stood there for a long moment, staring at them. They were thoughtful in the most distant way possible, like a gift sent by someone who had read about my illness in a newsletter. I heated the curry, poured it into a bowl, and sat down to eat. The flavors were the same, but they no longer brought comfort. It was as if the taste had been stripped of warmth, leaving only the mechanics of spice and salt. I chewed slowly, thinking about the gap between what I once had and what I was given now after lunch. I washed the bowl and left it to dry. My hands rested on the edge of the sink, the warm water dripping from my fingers. I thought about the last time Bella stayed with me when I was sick. It was years ago, before she had her own family. She brought me tea, tucked a blanket around me, and sat in the armchair flipping through a magazine. We did not talk much, but her presence was enough. I remember thinking, even then, that this was what care felt like, not grand gestures, but the quiet certainty that someone was there. The sticky note still lay on the counter beside the empty paper bag. I picked it up and read it again. Busy today. Feel better soon. The words were beginning to feel like a translation of something colder. Something like I have more important things to do or you'll manage on your own. I carried the note into the living room and set it on the coffee table. It seemed small against the worn wood, like a token from a life I was no longer part of. I sat in the armchair, looking at it, feeling the same mixture of sadness and clarity that had been growing in me since the fever began. The decision to leave was not born in that moment, but it took shape there. It began to feel less like an idea and more like a door I could see in the distance, a door that, once I stepped through, would close behind me for good. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a dull gray. The wind pushed against the windows in long, low breaths. I put on a sweater and sat at the desk by the window, pulling out my old notebook. I flipped past the list I had made the day before and began a new page at the top. I wrote one word, escape, beneath it. I listed the things I would need to do if I decided to go: sort through the house, call the realtor, move the savings to a separate account, find someone to take the plants, look into internet service at the farmhouse. The list grew quickly, each item feeling more real than the last. The act of writing steadied me. For so long my days had been built around waiting for Bella to visit, waiting for someone to need me, waiting for a life that had already shifted away from me. Now, here was something I could move toward, something I could shape with my own hands. The phone buzzed beside me, a message from Bella. Did you get the food? I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, yes, thank you. No reply came. I set the phone down, the weight of it suddenly unwelcome in my hand. Evening came slowly, the light fading to a soft blue that filled the corners of the room. I reheated the second container from the takeout bag and ate it without much thought. My appetite was still small, but I knew I needed the strength. After dinner, I walked through the house, noticing things I had not looked at closely in years. The framed photographs on the hallway wall, the blanket draped over the back of the couch, the bookshelf with its uneven rows. Each item carried a memory, but instead of holding me in place, they seemed to loosen something inside me. I began to see them not as pieces of my home, but as things I could leave behind. The night was quiet except for the occasional groan of the wind against the siding. I sat in bed with the notebook on my lap, reading over the list again. The word escape at the top looked less like a wish and more like a plan. I underlined it. Sleep came late. When it did, it brought dreams of the farmhouse again. This time, I saw it in the bright light of morning, the field stretching out in all directions, the porch chair rocking gently in the breeze. In the dream, I stood at the edge of the field, the grass brushing against my legs, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers. There was no one else in sight, and for the first time in a long while, the solitude felt like freedom instead of abandonment. When I woke, the image of the field stayed with me. It was as if my mind was reminding me that there was still a life I could choose, one that did not require me to wait for a knock on the door or a brief text message. I rose and began the day with a kind of quiet resolve. The takeout containers were gone. The sticky note still on the coffee table. I picked it up and placed it in the trash. It did not feel like throwing something away. It felt like making room for something new. The morning light filtered through the blinds in pale stripes. I stood in the hallway with a cup of tea, looking at the framed photographs on the wall as if seeing them for the first time. My breath fogged the surface of the cup, the steam curling upward and dissolving in the cool air. Each photograph was a little museum piece from a life that felt distant. Bella as a toddler in overalls, sitting in the grass with jam on her face. Bella at 10, missing a front tooth, holding up the science fair ribbon she had won. Bella at 18 in her graduation gown, standing between me and her father. In every photo, she was in the center, bright and solid, the axis around which our lives turned. I began to walk slowly along the hallway, my eyes scanning each frame. I remembered the moments when I hung them there, one at a time, over the years. Back then, I believed that capturing the moment would keep it alive somehow, that the photograph would serve as a tether between then and now. But as I stood there, it became clear that the tether had frayed. These images were no longer connected to the person who dropped food at my door with a note. I set the cup down on the table in the hallway and took the first photograph off the wall. The frame was light in my hands. I slid the photo out and placed it gently into a cardboard box I had brought from the closet. The frame went into another box. I repeated this with the next one, and the next, until the wall was bare. The act was not fueled by anger but by a sense of preparation. Each item I packed felt like one less anchor holding me to this place. I moved into the living room and surveyed the shelves. There were books I had read and books I had meant to read, their spines coated with a thin layer of dust. I ran my finger along one shelf and felt the grit catch on my skin. I began to pull the books down, stacking them into piles. Keep, donate, leave behind. On the coffee table lay the notebook with the word escape underlined on the first page. I added another column to my plan, inventory. I began listing each room in the house, making notes about what would go and what would stay. The list grew quickly. By midday, I had worked my way into the kitchen. This was where the weight of years was most visible. Mismatched mugs from vacations, chipped plates I never replaced, utensils that had belonged to my mother. I held each one for a moment before deciding. The mugs went into the keep pile, the plates into the donate box, the utensils stayed. I was not purging my life so much as sifting it, separating what I truly needed from what I had been keeping. Out of habit, the sound of the wind outside was steady, pressing against the windows. It made the house feel smaller, like the walls were folding in slightly. I took a break and sat at the kitchen table with a sandwich, the cardboard boxes stacked around me like small walls. The quiet was different now, less oppressive, more purposeful. After lunch, I went upstairs. Bella's old room was still as she had left it, though the air carried the faint smell of disuse. Posters of bands she once loved were still pinned to the walls, their corners curling. A row of trophies lined the top of the dresser. Her bed was neatly made, the comforter faded from years of sunlight through the window. I opened the closet and found the boxes she had never taken with her. Inside were notebooks from school, a pair of ice skates, a small jewelry box with a broken clasp. I sat cross-legged on the floor and opened one of the notebooks. The handwriting was hurried, filling the pages with song lyrics, doodles, lists of names. It was a snapshot of who she had been. A person full of intensity and impatience. I closed the notebook and set it aside. These were her things to decide about, not mine. Still, I knew she might never come back for them. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. I stood and stretched, my knees aching from sitting on the floor. I gathered the few things I wanted to keep from her room. A framed photo of the two of us at the beach, a scarf she had wear upon for me one winter, a small ceramic bird she made in art class. These went into a separate box, back in my own room. I opened the dresser drawers and began sorting through clothes. Some I had not worn in years, yet had kept as if they might be needed someday. As I worked, I thought about all the times I had set my own needs aside for Bella, or for the life we had together. It was not a regret exactly, but an awareness of how much space I had given away over the years. By evening, the house looked subtly altered. There were bare spaces on the walls, shelves with gaps, boxes stacked neatly in corners. It was the visual beginning of an ending. I made tea and sat at the desk by the window. The street outside was quiet, the light from the lamppost pooling on the pavement. I opened the notebook again and read over my list. There was a satisfaction in seeing the progress written down. in knowing that each small step was carrying me closer to that imagined field around the farmhouse. The phone buzzed. Another message from Bella. How are you feeling? I typed, better, just resting. She replied quickly, good, glad the food helped. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovered over the keys, ready to type something more, something about the photographs, or the boxes, or the decision-taking route in me, but I stopped. This was not the moment to explain. She would not hear it for what it was. I set the phone face down on the table and picked up my tea. The steam rose in thin, twisting ribbons. The quiet of the room wrapped around me, no longer an emptiness but a shield. I sipped slowly, tasting the faint bitterness of the leaves. That night, I dreamed again of the farmhouse. This time, I was inside it. The walls were bare, the air smelled of wood and rain, and the sound of the wind against the roof was steady and low. I was alone, but not lonely. My hands rested on a wooden table, the surface warm from the sunlight streaming through the window. When I woke, the image was still there. I could almost feel the grain of the wood under my palms. I lay in bed for a while, watching the light change on the ceiling, knowing that each day brought me closer to stepping into that dream and making it real. The morning began with the sound of rain against the windows, a steady rhythm, not hurried, not violent, just enough to make the world feel smaller and more contained. I pulled the curtains aside and watched it slide down the glass in thin, silvery lines. The street outside was empty. The air looked clean and cold. I wrapped myself in the thick gray cardigan I kept on the back of the chair and went to the kitchen. The kettle hissed and clicked as it heated, the sound filling the quiet. I poured the water over the tea leaves in the pot and let them steep while I stood at the counter, staring at the notebook from yesterday. The word inventory was still underlined. Beneath it, the neat list of rooms and items looked almost like a map of my life. Something in me shifted as I looked at it. The boxes I had packed over the last few days were no longer just storage. They were proof of movement. Proof that I could dismantle a life piece by piece if I chose to. I poured the tea and carried the cup to the small table by the window. The rain tapped against the glass in uneven beats. I thought about the farmhouse again. Not just the idea of it, but the feel of it, the roughness of the wood floors under my feet. The smell of earth after rain, the kind of silence that comes from being far from everything. I opened my laptop and typed in old farmhouse for sale rural. The search results filled the screen, each thumbnail a small square of possibility. Some were crumbling and worn, their paint peeled back by decades of weather. Others had been restored. Gleaming under bright sunlight, I clicked through them, slowly, my eyes catching on details. A deep porch with a swing, a wide kitchen with a window over the sink, a field rolling out toward the horizon. Hours passed without me noticing. I was deep inside a world that felt both new and familiar, as if I had been here before in another version of my life. I bookmarked 3 listings. All were within a few hours' drive of the city. The rain eased by midday and pale light began to filter through the clouds. I decided to take a walk. The air outside smelled fresh, and the streets were still damp. My boots made a soft sound against the pavement. I walked without a set route, letting my feet take me where they wanted. As I moved through the neighborhood, I saw the houses I had passed countless times, neat gardens, trimmed hedges, curtains drawn just so. They looked the same as ever, yet I felt something different. I realized it was the knowledge that I might not be here much longer. The familiar was already becoming distant. I passed the small park where Bella had played as a child. The swings creaked gently in the breeze. The benches were wet from the rain. I stood for a moment, watching the empty space where she used to run, her laughter ringing out. It was a soft ache, not sharp but present. I turned and kept walking back home. I made a simple lunch and ate it standing at the counter. My phone buzzed with a notification. A reminder about the community meeting that evening. I had planned to go, but the thought of sitting in a room filled with neighbors discussing potholes and garbage collection felt irrelevant now. I deleted the reminder. In the afternoon, I returned to the listings I had bookmarked. I studied the photos again, this time imagining myself inside them. I pictured my books on the shelves, my tea kettle on the stove, my shoes by the door. The thought brought a calmness I had not felt in years. I began to research moving companies, just to see. I looked up storage facilities, rural internet providers, even weather patterns in the areas I was considering. The more I searched, the more real it became. By evening, I had a rough plan. I would visit the farmhouses in the next 2 weeks. If one felt right, I would make an offer. The apartment lease was month to month now, so leaving would be simple. I would take what I needed, donate the rest, and start over. The thought of telling Bella crossed my mind. I could imagine her reaction, confusion first, then disbelief. Then the casual dismissal she often gave my ideas. The pattern was familiar. I decided I would not tell her until everything was set. This was not about her approval, it was about my choice. I sat at the desk and wrote a new heading in the notebook, decision. Under it, I wrote, visit farmhouses, choose one, arrange moving company, donate unused items, close city chapter. The list was short, but each line felt solid. Night came quickly. The rain returning in light bursts against the windows. I turned off the overhead lights and lit a candle on the table. Its flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I sat there, listening to the quiet, feeling the certainty settle deeper inside me. This was no longer a wish or half-formed thought. It was a direction, a line drawn from here to somewhere else, a line I intended to follow. The day I decided to start packing in earnest. The morning light came in cold and sharp through the living room window. It lit up the dust motes floating in the air, catching them in motion like tiny, weightless secrets. I set a cardboard box on the floor and folded its edges together until the structure held. The tape made a crisp sound as I sealed the bottom. That sound alone made the decision feel irreversible. I began in the hallway closet. Coats I had not worn in years hung neatly in a row, their shoulders stiff from disuse. I took them down one by one, feeling the texture of each fabric before placing it in either the keep pile or the donation bag. The closet grew barer with each choice. In the bedroom, I slid open the dresser drawers and found clothes that carried their own quiet history. A scarf from a trip to Italy with Bella when she was still small enough to hold my hand without self-consciousness. A sweater my late husband had bought me for our last anniversary together. I folded them carefully, knowing which ones I would take and which ones would stay behind. I worked in silence, letting the rhythm of the task guide me. Open, sort, fold, place, seal. By midday, 5 boxes stood neatly by the wall, each labeled. In black marker, the labels looked bold against the brown cardboard, as if declaring themselves part of a new chapter. When the doorbell rang, I froze. I was not expecting anyone. My first thought was Bella, but she rarely arrived without warning. I opened the door to find Mrs. Hahn from next door holding a small potted plant. I overwatered my succulents again. She said with a smile, "Thought you might like one before I kill it." I thanked her and placed it on the kitchen counter. She glanced at the boxes stacked in the corner. "Spring cleaning?" she asked. "In a way," I replied, keeping my tone light. She nodded but lingered for a moment, as if sensing there was more to the story. When she finally left, I closed the door gently and stood for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. It struck me how easily someone could mistake this for an ordinary day. That afternoon, I called to moving companies and requested quotes. I made sure to ask about short notice moves and small load services. The second company's representative spoke with efficiency, offering a date 3 weeks away. I booked it. With a date set, my pace quickened. Each day after that I packed another few boxes. Books came first, their weight familiar in my hands. I lined them up neatly inside, spines facing up as if they were still on a shelf. Then came the kitchen, mugs, plates, utensils. I kept only what I would need for the next few weeks. I made nightly trips to the donation center to neighborhoods away. Each time I carried bags inside. The clerk would smile and offer a receipt for tax purposes. I never took it. It felt cleaner to let the things go without keeping a record. The secrecy was both thrilling and exhausting. I avoided inviting anyone over, even for a short visit. I kept the curtains drawn more often. If Bella called, I made sure the tape gun was out of sight before answering. One evening, I sat on the floor with a box open in front of me, surrounded by old photographs. There was one of Bella on her first day of kindergarten, her hair in 2 braids, her smile missing a front tooth. Another of the 3 of us, me, Bella, and my husband, at a beach, the horizon behind us blurred by the summer haze. I decided to take only a small selection, the ones that felt essential. The rest I placed in a labeled envelope for Bella to keep. As the days passed, the apartment became less of a home and more of a shell. Walls that once held shelves now stood bare. The space echoed in strange ways. At night, I would walk from room to room, feeling the weight of the emptiness grow. Strangely, it did not frighten me. It felt like a clearing, a space being prepared for something new. The Friday before the move, I drove out to see one of the farmhouses I had bookmarked. It stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by fields that stretched into the distance. The paint was faded, but the porch was wide, and the roof looked solid inside. The air smelled faintly of wood and rain. The kitchen had a window above the sink that opened to a view of an old oak tree. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, listening to the quiet. There was no hum of traffic, no neighbors through the walls, only the distant call of a bird outside. By the time I reached the back porch, I knew this was the place. I called the realtor that evening and made an offer. She sounded pleased, almost surprised by my decisiveness. When I hung up, I sat in the darkened living room of my apartment and listened to the rain starting again outside. The next morning, I began sealing the last of the boxes. I kept my movements deliberate, feeling the weight of each decision. I left out only the clothes and dishes I would need until the movers came. The rest was stacked neatly, ready to go. 3 days before the move, Bella called. Her voice was cheerful, full of casual updates about her work. I listened, responding where necessary, but I did not mention the farmhouse or the packed boxes. This was mine to carry until it was complete. When I hung up, I felt the familiar mixture of affection and distance. The decision to keep this from her was no longer a question. It was a boundary. The night before the movers were due, I stood in the center of the living room and looked around. The plant Mrs. Hahn had given me sat alone on the windowsill. The rest of the space was stripped bare, ready for departure. I felt no hesitation, only the steady beat of resolve. In the morning, the movers would come. By afternoon, I would be on the road, leaving this chapter behind. The city would fade in the rearview mirror, and with it the version of myself that had stayed too long in one place. The first morning in the farmhouse. The quiet was almost startling. It was not the kind of quiet that sat heavily on your shoulders. It was open and clear, like a field after the snow has settled. I woke to sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the faint sound of wind moving across the fields outside. The movers had left late the previous afternoon, their truck rumbling down the dirt road until the sound disappeared. The house was filled with neatly stacked boxes, some labeled in my handwriting, others with the movers' quick scrawl. My bed was already assembled, but nothing else had been set in place. I made coffee in the small kitchen, the aroma filling the space quickly. The window above the sink framed a wide view of the oak tree in the backyard. Its branches stretched in all directions, thick and sturdy. The kind of tree that had likely been here for longer than the house itself. The coffee was strong, almost too strong, but I drank it slowly, standing at the window. In the city, I had grown used to the background of car horns, construction, and the occasional voice calling from the street below. Here, the sounds came in layers I had never paid attention to before. The low hum of wind through grass, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of the house settling. I spent the morning unpacking the kitchen. Each plate and cup found a place in the cupboards, each utensil in its drawer. It was a small task, but it felt grounding. By midday, I had a working kitchen and a table cleared enough for a simple lunch. I ate quietly, letting the stillness keep me company. In the afternoon, I stepped outside to explore the property. The farmhouse sat on a modest piece of land, but the openness made it feel endless. A narrow path wound from the back porch to a shed that leaned slightly to one side. The grass was long, brushing against my ankles as I walked. I found a small patch of wildflowers near the far fence, their petals bright against the green. Returning to the house, I noticed how the air smelled different here. It carried the scent of grass and earth, sharper after the morning's dew had dried. I realized I was breathing more deeply without meaning to. That evening, I cooked my first dinner in the farmhouse. Nothing elaborate, just roasted vegetables and bread, but the act of preparing it in my own kitchen felt like a ceremony. I sat at the table by the window and watched the sky shift from pale blue to a deep, warm orange. As darkness settled, the stars began to appear, more than I had seen in years. The first night was quiet, but not entirely comfortable. The unfamiliar creaks and groans of the house kept me alert. At one point, I woke to the sound of an owl somewhere nearby. It took a while before I fell asleep again, But when I did, it was deep and dreamless. Over the next week, I developed a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and a walk around the property. I unpacked slowly, choosing where things belonged with care. I found myself moving more deliberately, not rushing through tasks as I used to. I started a small list of projects for the house. The shed needed repairs, the porch steps were slightly loose, and the fence on the west side leaned outward. I was not in a hurry to complete them, but writing them down made me feel engaged with the place. One afternoon, I drove into the nearest town, a short trip down a winding road. The main street was lined with small shops, a bakery, a hardware store, a bookstore with faded blue paint. I stopped in the bakery for bread and coffee. The woman behind the counter greeted me warmly and asked if I was new in the area. When I said yes, she smiled in a way that made it clear news traveled quickly here. Back at the farmhouse, I set the fresh bread on the counter and made a sandwich. I ate it outside on the porch, letting the warm breeze move across my skin. The air carried the faint scent of hay from somewhere nearby. It was during these early days that I noticed how solitude was different from loneliness. In the city, I often felt lonely even surrounded by people. Here, being alone felt spacious rather than hollow. I could feel my thoughts stretching, untangling themselves in ways they never had before. One morning, I set up a small desk near the window in the living room. It became my workspace, a place to write and plan. I began researching part-time consulting work, something I could do remotely. The idea of earning my own income again stirred something in me, a sense of self that had been buried under years of routine. By the second week, I had signed up for an online photography course. I wanted to learn how to capture the light and space around me. In the evenings, I would walk the fields with my camera, experimenting with angles and shadows, the act of noticing details. A bird in mid-flight, the curve of a leaf, the way sunlight caught on a spider's web, became a practice in seeing my life differently. The days grew longer, the light lingering well into the evening. I began to cook more, experimenting with recipes I had clipped from magazines years ago but never tried. The meals were simple, but each one felt like an act of care for myself. One evening, as I was watering the small potted plant Mrs. Hahn had given me, I realized it had begun to grow new shoots. It felt like a quiet mirror to my own slow changes. By the end of the first month, I no longer woke in the night startled by the sounds of the house. I recognized the groan of the floorboards and the way the wind pressed against the windows during a storm. The farmhouse was no longer just a place I had moved into. It was becoming mine. And in that growing sense of ownership, I felt something I had not in years. The certainty that I could build a life that belonged only to me. It was a Thursday morning in late spring when the call came. I had been sitting at my desk, reviewing notes for a small consulting project I had taken on. The sunlight spilled through the window in long rectangles, warming the wooden floor. A soft breeze moved the curtains, carrying with it the smell of freshly cut grass from somewhere beyond the fence. The phone vibrated against the desk, the screen lighting up with Bella's name. For a moment, I just watched it. The name felt both familiar and far now. I had not heard her voice in weeks, not since the day she left Takeout at my door with that brief text. When I finally answered, her voice came through bright but sharp, the way it always did when she wanted something. "Mom, where are you?" I leaned back in my chair. "Good morning to you too. I just drove by your place in the city. There's a for rent sign. Your curtains are gone. What's going on?" "I moved," I said simply. There was a pause. I imagined her standing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, trying to make sense of the empty apartment she thought she knew. "You moved, without telling me?" Her tone was caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation. "Yes." Another pause, then a sharp inhale. "Why? When? Where are you?" "I'm living in the country now, about 2 hours away, in a farmhouse." I could almost hear her frown through the phone. "A farmhouse? What are you talking about? Since when do you live in the country? You've never mentioned wanting to leave." I looked out the window at the wide stretch of grass and the oak tree swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't think I needed to mention it. Her voice rose slightly. "You've always told me things like this, big changes. Why would you just disappear?" "Because I wanted to," I said, "and because I didn't want to explain myself this time." There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something more controlled, the kind of voice she used when she was trying to stay composed in front of an audience. "This is really unlike you, Mom. Is everything okay? Did something happen? I thought about the weeks before I left. The fever, the sound of her voice saying I'm busy, the bag of takeout cooling at my doorstep. I thought about the years before that, the countless times my feelings had been brushed aside as though they were an inconvenience. I decided I needed a change, I said, so I made one. She laughed. But it was short and humorless. You can't just up and leave like that. What about me? What if I needed you? The question sat heavily in the air between us. I let it linger for a moment before answering. If you needed me, you could have called. You didn't. Her breath caught. Are you still upset about the takeout thing? I told you I was busy. I couldn't just drop everything. It's not just that, I said. It's a lot of things. Years of things. She was quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. Not confusion, resistance. Well, she said finally, I think it's selfish. You didn't even consider how this would affect me. I have considered you for most of my life, Bella, this time. I considered myself. Her voice sharpened. Again, I don't understand you anymore. That's fine, I said. I'm starting to understand myself. I could hear her shifting, maybe pacing. So what? You're just going to live out there forever, alone? I'm not alone. I have myself, I have work, I have space. She scoffed. You sound like you're trying to prove something. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm living my life in a way that feels right to me. There was a click of her tongue, a sound she made when she wanted to dismiss something without saying it outright. I don't think this is healthy. I smiled faintly, even though she couldn't see it. I do. The conversation ended not long after. She said she had to go, that she was meeting someone for lunch. I told her to enjoy it. She hung up without saying goodbye when the call ended. I sat for a moment in the quiet, the sound of the wind filling the space she had left behind. I did not feel the ache I had expected. Instead, I felt a kind of clarity, as though something heavy had shifted out of place and settled where it belonged. I went outside and stood on the porch, letting the sunlight touch my face. In the distance, the oak tree swayed slowly, patient and steady. I thought about the conversation, about the way she had reacted, about how I had answered without bending or apologizing. For years, I had measured my choices against her reactions, trying to avoid her disapproval. But now, standing in the open air, I realized I did not need her approval to feel steady on my feet. The farmhouse was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that felt alive. I went back inside, sat at my desk, and picked up where I had left off before the phone rang. My work was waiting, and so was the rest of my day. The call had been a rupture, but it had also been a confirmation. I had done the right thing. It happened 3 weeks after the first call. I had settled into a rhythm at the farmhouse. Mornings were for work, afternoons for tending to the small garden I had started behind the house, and evenings for reading on the porch until the light drained from the sky. The days felt like clean pages. Then Bella arrived without warning. I saw her car coming up the dirt road, dust billowing behind her like a small storm. She parked in the gravel drive, the engine still running for a moment before she shut it off. I stood at the doorway, waiting. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and an expression I knew too well. Tight mouth, lifted chin, a look that announced she was here to make a point. Can we talk? She asked, walking past me into the house before I could answer. Inside, she looked around with quick, sharp glances. So this is it, the farmhouse. It's different, it's home, I said. She turned to face me, pulling her sunglasses off. Her eyes were restless, scanning me like she was searching for an opening. I don't get it, Mom. I don't get what you're doing here. You've cut yourself off from everything from me. I haven't cut you off, I said. You can call me, you can visit, like today. She laughed once, without humor. It's not the same. You used to be 5 minutes away. Now you're hours away. You didn't even tell me you were thinking about moving. You just disappeared. I told you why. I said no. You gave me a vague excuse about needing a change, but this feels extreme. It feels like you're punishing me for something. I studied her face, the slight flare of her nostrils, the set of her jaw. I'm not punishing you. I'm choosing a life that feels right for me. She stepped closer. But why now? Why like this? Is it because of that day, the takeout thing? You're still holding on to that, aren't you? It's not just that day, I said quietly. It's many days. It's years. She froze, eyes narrowing. Years of what? Years of feeling like I didn't matter unless I was doing something for you. Years of having my needs brushed aside because they were inconvenient. Years of pretending it didn't hurt. Her voice sharpened. That's not fair. I've always loved you. I've always appreciated you. Love and appreciation are not the same as respect and consideration, I said. She blinked, and for a moment her face softened. But then the tension returned. You're twisting things. I have my own life. I can't drop everything for you. Every time you feel sick or lonely, I never asked you to drop everything, I said. I asked you to care. There's a difference. She shook her head. This is ridiculous. You're making me out to be some kind of villain because I couldn't bring you soup when you had a cold. It wasn't about the soup, I said, my voice steady but firm. It was about the message. That I wasn't worth rearranging your day for. That your schedule, your priorities, always came first. No matter what I was going through. Her mouth opened, but no words came for a moment. Then she said, I didn't know you felt like this. You never said anything. I did. Many times. You just didn't want to hear it. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She stood still. Her hands curled into loose fists at her sides. So what now? She asked finally. You live out here, away from me, forever. That's the plan. I live where I want to live. You visit if you want to. That's the plan. She stared at me as though I had just spoken a foreign language. This isn't the mom I know. I think this is the mom you've always had, I said. You just never saw her clearly. Her eyes glistened then, though she quickly looked away. You're really not coming back. No, I said, I'm not. Her gaze swept the room again, slower this time. She took in the worn armchair by the window. The book stacked neatly on the side table. The vase of wildflowers on the counter. You look different, she said quietly. I feel different. For a moment, we stood in a stillness that wasn't entirely hostile. She seemed to be searching for something in my face, a crack, a sign that I might change my mind. But there was nothing for her to find. Finally, she picked up her bag from the chair. I should go. I walked her to the door. She paused on the porch, looking out at the open field, the oak tree swaying gently in the distance. It's quiet here, she said. It's peaceful, I replied. She nodded once, then turned and walked to her car. I watched as she drove away, the sound of gravel crunching under her tires fading into the distance. When she was gone, I stood on the porch for a long time, letting the breeze move through me. The conversation had been raw, and it had opened old wounds, but it had also brought something else, a finality I hadn't realized I needed. I went back inside, closed the door, and felt the quiet settle around me again. This time, it felt like strength. The morning after Bella left, I woke before sunrise. A pale blue light spread across the horizon, brushing the fields with a cool glow. I made tea and carried the mug to the porch, sitting in the old wicker chair that had quickly become my favorite place to begin the day. The air was crisp, and the silence was complete except for the low rustle of leaves in the distance. For a long time, I simply sat there, listening. I realized that in my old life, I had rarely heard pure silence. There had always been the hum of traffic, the faint thump of bass from a neighbor's apartment, the constant digital chatter of phones and televisions. Here, silence was not an absence but a presence, a living, breathing thing that filled the space around me. By 8 o'clock, I had already checked my email and sent out a proposal for a new consulting client. The work came easier now, my mind uncluttered by the background noise of resentment and exhaustion. I had learned to manage my schedule so that no single day felt like a race. Around mid-morning, I walked out to the garden. The tomato plants were coming in strong and the basil leaves were lush and fragrant. I knelt in the dirt, harvesting enough to make a simple lunch later. It struck me how satisfying it felt to touch something I had grown myself, to see direct results from my care. In my previous life, I had poured care into people and situations that yielded nothing but disappointment. This was different. After lunch, I settled into the sunroom with a book. The light streamed through the tall windows, warming my legs. I found myself reading slowly, letting each sentence sink in. No longer rushing to finish or moving on to the next task. There was no clock pushing me forward. Time felt generous here. The phone rang once in the early afternoon. Bella's name flashed on the screen. I watched it ring and did not answer, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I had nothing more to say at that moment. I had given her my truth, and now it was hers to sit with. Later, I walked the edge of the property. The fields were dotted with wildflowers, their colors bright against the deep green of the grass. I found a path I had not noticed before, winding toward a small creek at the far edge of the land. I followed it, listening to the crunch of my boots against the dirt, the steady rhythm of my own breath. When I reached the creek, I sat on a flat stone and watched the water move. It was narrow but quick, darting around rocks and fallen branches. I thought of how water always finds a way forward. No matter what blocks its path, it does not rage against the stones. It shapes itself to move past them. That night, I made a simple dinner, pasta with the fresh tomatoes and basil from the garden. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, then washed the dishes and left them to dry. The kitchen smelled faintly of garlic and warm bread. After dinner, I opened my laptop and joined a virtual group for small business owners in rural areas. The conversation was lively, and I found myself offering advice to a younger woman just starting her own consulting business. She thanked me, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. My knowledge still mattered, my presence still mattered. The following days took on a pattern that was both steady and alive. Mornings on the porch, afternoons in the garden or working, evenings spent reading or writing. Sometimes I joined an online workshop or streamed a live lecture from a university in another state. My world felt both larger and calmer than it had in years. Bella called again a week later. This time, she left a voicemail. Her voice sounded less sharp, more tentative. "Hey, Mom. Just wanted to see how you're doing. Call me when you can." I listened to it twice, then deleted it, not out of cruelty, but because I knew that if I called back too soon, the old patterns might creep in again. I needed more time to stand on this new ground. One afternoon, I drove into the small town nearby to pick up supplies. The woman at the hardware store recognized me from a local community meeting and asked if I would consider joining the town's volunteer garden project. I said yes. It felt good to say yes to something that was purely about connection and not obligation. As the weeks passed, I noticed changes in myself. My shoulders no longer ached from tension. My thoughts moved with more clarity. I laughed more often, even when I was alone. The weight of unspoken disappointment had lifted. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I lit a candle in the living room and sat in the armchair by the window. The fields outside glowed gold, and the air smelled faintly of hay. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who waited for calls, who measured her worth in crumbs of attention. She seemed distant now, like someone I had known long ago but could no longer picture clearly. My phone sat on the table beside me. It was silent. I reached over, turned it face down, and leaned back into the chair. This was my life now, and it was enough.